Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest today is Anson Frericks. He's the author of Last Call for Bud Light. We're going to talk about the Go Woke, Go Broke phenomenon. He's a former president at Anheuser-Busch, formerly the home of America's most popular brewery. And he watched the company pretty much unravel when the whole Dylan Mulvaney fiasco happened. So we're going to talk about that in his book. So welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Richard. Appreciate you having me on the show today.
Give me some background. Like, how did you start working with Anheuser-Busch, and what position were you in, and what were you doing at the time of this horrible decision?
Yeah. So, a little bit of an interesting background. I never thought of myself as a large consumer products good guy or kind of a big corporate guy. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. Out of school, out of undergrad, I worked at a private equity firm in Boston. Then I went back to business school. I was at Harvard Business School. And I was actually interning at a hedge fund in New York when Anheuser-Busch had just been acquired by InBev. And I kind of ran into these guys in New York, the board members and some of their senior executive folks who were looking for kind of American folks to come in and help kind of run the business they just acquired. And they convinced me that Anheuser-Busch was actually the world's largest private equity firm that happened to sell beer. Their whole background was they were a couple of Brazilian guys that had kind of rolled up the South American beer market. Then they did the same thing about InBev over in Europe, which are in brands like Leffe, Hoegaarden, and Stella Artois. They just bought Anheuser-Busch in the U.S. They said, hey, we're going to go on to buy Grupo Modelo, SAB Miller, potentially Coke, Pepsi, who knows down the line. And it was kind of intriguing, and it wasn't what I was expecting. And they also said that we're also a big meritocracy. We're a business where we want to hire the best and brightest, win them to come in, run large business units, and we'd love to have you on board. So it wasn't anything that I was really thinking about, but they recruited me over kind of a couple-month time period. And actually, the night I got engaged to my wife, I said, hey, these guys want to not only have me work for Anheuser-Busch InBev, but they want us to live over in Europe. And you're interested in living in Europe for a couple of years? And she said, of course, that'd be amazing. So that was the short story about how we ended up there. So I started in a finance role because that's what I was doing beforehand with Anheuser-Busch. I moved around to multiple different positions within the company. Was running certain business units in the U.S. Was eventually president of Anheuser-Busch. And funny enough, I actually left Anheuser-Busch about a year before this Dylan Mulvaney piece happened. I started a company called Strive Asset Management with Vivek Ramaswamy, who's a buddy of mine from high school. And so we were kind of like right in the middle of this situation of kind of what went wrong with, I'll say, American free market shareholder capitalism, where for kind of like lack of a better word, this whole kind of woke capitalism movement, which is how you would, I guess, probably the media would really describe it. I describe it more specifically as this movement away from free market shareholder capitalism, as Milton Friedman talked about in the U.S., but more towards this European stakeholder capitalism movement. Really took over a lot of corporate America, but I think, kind of Bud Light and Anheuser-Busch became the poster child of what really went wrong.
Yeah, and Vivek had his own book, I think, Woke Incorporated, where his own company, people were attacking him as CEO, and he had his own problems, right?
Yeah, no, he did. So, I was kind of president of Anheuser-Busch at the time, and how we kind of got together was we've been buddies since high school. We did mock trial together in high school and then kind of went to similar schools and had similar backgrounds. And like a lot of folks in the summer of 2021, we just had more time on their hands. It was kind of still a lot of things were shut down during COVID. And Vivek and I were talking over the summer about, frankly, like what really went wrong with kind of American capitalism. Why were all these companies getting involved in political and social issues? Like I was living in Atlanta, Georgia at the time, and you might remember there was this whole Georgia voting rights initiative that happened where folks in Georgia voted for representatives that you need to have an ID to vote. And it was really interesting to me. It was really kind of corporate America's reaction to this sort of democratically adjudicated policy where you had a big firm called BlackRock, the world's largest asset management company. It was one of the first that came out and said, we're against this law. We're going to push back on this. Other companies should as well. And then you had companies that were local in Atlanta, like Coca-Cola, Delta, had nothing to do with voter integrity laws, but they started pushing back on this. You may recall like Major League Baseball canceled an All-Star game in Atlanta that year as well. And they moved it to Coors Field. And I didn't sell any beer at Coors Field in Denver when I was at Anheuser-Busch. And so like I was frustrated with what was going on. I saw a lot of my friends, neighbors throwing out Coca-Cola, throwing out kind of their Major League Baseball tickets after this. And Vivek and I were having this conversation. He had just been kind of stepped down from his company because his board and some of his employees were asking him to get involved in some of the Black Lives Matter movement, getting involved in some of the racial justice piece, talking about these voter integrity laws as well. And so we were talking about like, what's driving this? Like, why are all these businesses getting involved in this? Most importantly, we think that it's, first bad for business because a lot of people are now throwing out Coca-Cola or throwing out, again, Major League Baseball tickets because these organizations are taking orthogonal positions to a lot of their customer base and taking positions that aren't really consistent with their mission. And then secondarily, it seems like it's kind of bad for democracy as well. Like why all of a sudden do we have this small group of really kind of like CEOs and asset managers that are making big political decisions as opposed to sort of like our democratic process where we have individual citizens that are supposed to have the rights to vote on these issues. And that's how we solve issues, not through this sort of like monarchical group of asset managers and CEOs. So anyway, that's kind of how we kind of came together and started Strive, which is the asset management company that we created to really be an alternative to BlackRock, really focused on American free market shareholder capitalism, as opposed to a lot of the organizations, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, a lot of their banks had adopted this European kind of stakeholder model, which became essentially like woke capitalism.
It's, and I just had a thought. It seems like, with COVID, that was kind of the first top-down authoritarian push by, every country in the world. And that seemed to open the door for all this wokeness and this, everyone attacking ideas that were opposite of their own or not, in line with their own. Do you think that it played a role, or what do you think was the real origin of all these problems?
Yeah, I think actually COVID was the spark that lit, I'll say the kindling and this bonfire that had been building for I think like a number of years. And I mean, just backing up maybe 10 years, like I think actually like the seeds of really like COVID and companies getting more involved in politics, it actually really goes back to kind of the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009. If you remember, there was a lot of anger that was pushed at banks when a lot of them imploded in 2008, 2009. A lot of individual kind of folks thought they were kind of holding the bag as banks got bailed out. There was the whole Occupy Wall Street movement that popped up, and the Occupy Wall Street movement kind of demanded that banks atone for their sins. And one of the things that sort of the banks and asset managers started doing was adopting this policy of ESG, or environmental social governance, which that term first appeared in kind of 2004 in a UN report on who wins matters, was sort of the name of this UN report. And they were trying to figure out how governments and businesses could work more closely together to solve kind of existential crises. It was more of a UN-driven piece. U.S. didn't really pay any attention to it. But after sort of that Occupy Wall Street movement, a lot of asset managers decided, hey, here's an easy way for us to be able to so-called, do good in the public view while also making money. So you started sort of in the mid kind of the 2012 to 17, 18 period, you started seeing these ESG funds pop up, environmental social governance kind of pop up. And the interesting thing about them is that banks and asset managers kind of saw that, hey, if I just exclude an oil and gas company, or if I just exclude a tobacco company from an index, I can charge 2 to 3 times the amount of money that I'm charging for a regular kind of low-fee passive index fund like an S&P 500 fund or a growth fund. The problem with this was that there was this sort of fiduciary conflict for a lot of investors because most people, especially pension funds and a lot of everyday folks, they just want asset managers that are taking their money, go and maximize value, give me the returns, and I'll donate to whatever cause I see fit. So there was this sort of this tension that, a lot of companies were trying to do what's called the ESG piece. They never really defined what that was. I mean, everyone kind of defined it differently. And there was in conflict with a lot of fiduciary laws. In 2018, though, there was this big seminal moment that happened where Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, he wrote this letter to all the corporations in the U.S. talking about his philosophy of stakeholder capitalism. This is where he moved away from what Milton Friedman says was the purpose of a corporation in the 1970s, which was like focus on your shareholders, focus on shareholder value. You do that by creating great products and services. And he sort of wrote this letter saying that now we're adopting stakeholder capitalism, which is this sort of European World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, who runs that group. That was their view of the world. And he got the Business Roundtable in the U.S., which is an influential group of CEOs, to adopt this resolution of the Business Roundtable to evolve the purpose of a corporation in the U.S. away from shareholder value to this stakeholder value.
So when he was munching on like fried crickets while he was writing this letter.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Exactly. You will have nothing and you will be happy. That was exactly it. I mean, that was kind of the mentality of this. But and this started going down this rabbit hole because, in theory, you would say, okay, yeah, of course, companies need to do like things that are environmentally good. Of course, companies need to do things that are socially good. Of course, they have to do corporate governance. But then you start getting into the details. So what does that exactly mean? There's I would say like ESG, they're just risks that any companies have to abide by. Like when I was at Anheuser-Busch, we had environmental risk. If we didn't have water, we couldn't produce beer, especially in emerging market. We had certain social risk where we couldn't employ, sort of underage people in our breweries, or like child labor. And there's governance risk of making sure you had sort of staggered boards. But unfortunately, this whole ESG concept that got hijacked really during COVID. So, and I'll give you a really good example. I mean, during COVID, as we recall, COVID hits and there's this existential crisis where we think the world's coming to an end. And there was a lot of lawmakers were originally pushing actually Donald Trump to sign what's called the Defense Production Act. And this is where the U.S. government, they can essentially compel private corporations to do things like create generators. If you need more generators for hospitals, they could do that with General Electric. For 3M, you could do more ventilators. If you need to do more ventilators, have people being able to breathe. You could compel organizations like, Walmart, if you wanted to set up COVID testing. And so the government, they actually, Trump kind of signed this Defense Production Act against a lot of the concerns of his own people, thinking that you now have corporations that were getting off mission and off track. And essentially, that's what really happened. This existential crisis, I mean, you have all these airlines, Delta and United and American. Instead of flying passengers, they're flying medical supplies. And Anheuser-Busch, I mean, we're all of a sudden making hand sanitizer instead of beer because everybody needed hand sanitizer at the time. So you had all these companies that all of a sudden got diverted from their mission, but it was all to fight this invisible enemy. And even the time, Trump says I'm a wartime president. We're essentially going to war. We're going to fight COVID. And frankly, we were pretty successful early on. If you remember the whole idea when COVID first hit, it was stop, flatten the curve. Don't have hospitals be overrun. And if you think about it, I mean, by, really the end of April, May, their hospitals weren't overrun. I remember living in Atlanta. They had the whole Atlanta Falcons Stadium, ready to go to have, a bunch of people hosted there. And the hospitals were empty in the South. And
then they stopped listening to the reason. They just kept on and on and on and on.
That's right. And it kept going on and on. So it was all of a sudden, all these corporations felt good because you all of a sudden, defeated this invisible problem of COVID. But then, in May, if you remember this, at the end of May, you had the George Floyd incident. And, George Floyd ends up being murdered. And all of a sudden there were all of these calls of, well, hey, all of these companies have solved this, so-called COVID crisis. Well, now the next sort of an invisible enemy that we have to defeat is systemic racism. And so that was the next piece where now all of a sudden, if you were a company and you didn't put a black square and say, Black Lives Matter, all of a sudden you had people that were saying, oh, you as a company are you guys are racist, or if you didn't donate enough to BLM, or if you as a company, you didn't all of a sudden put in quota systems. And a big part of the ESG movement, the stakeholder capitalism movement, especially that S prong, the social prong, became forcing companies to put in, kind of quota system to try and stamp out systemic racism. And even if one of the big things you'll take a look at from a numerical standpoint is if you are a large corporation, every year, if you own $25,000 at any publicly traded corporation, you can put up a shareholder proposal that all the shareholders vote on. And a lot of these proposals tend to be things around the board members that you're going to elect, or around, do you want to have, who's your auditor going to be? A lot of it's kind of like relatively banal, but there became this big influx of ESG shareholder proposals in this 2020 and 2021 timeframe of all these people, a lot of activist organizations asking companies to put money up to defund the police, or to do racial equity audits to figure out how they contribute to systemic racism, or to figure out how they were going to use less oil and gas or decrease their energy needs in the name of solving climate change. And there used to be, before kind of this 2020 time period, before COVID, less than 5% of these ESG proposals would pass on an annual basis. But in sort of the COVID time period of 2020 and 2021, you had, in a lot of cases, 30, 40, 50% of these passing, and you had three large asset managers, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, voting for 40 to 50% of these. And they control 30% of almost every single company in the United States that's publicly traded because of the large funds that they have. So to your original question of yes, COVID was a big issue of companies getting involved in these political issues. And then all of a sudden, companies diverted their mission not only to solve COVID, but then it was like systemic racism, and then it was to defund the police, and then it's overturning election integrity laws. It was a lot of sort of political policies on the left. And how did this kind of come to be? Well, at the end of the day, you just kind of follow money. And where was a lot of the money being given to, like, the BlackRocks, the State Streets, the Vanguards that were asking companies to get involved in a lot of these issues? Well, it came from the largest pension funds in the United States and in Europe, places like the state of California, the state of New York, Norway Sovereign Wealth Fund. It was asking all of these companies to put pressure, or asking their large asset managers to put pressure on individual companies to get more involved politically, socially, and using sort of that ESG as its tenant, and really stakeholder capitalism was sort of its spear that it was driving for companies to get more actively involved.
So all this was about money the whole time. All these issues, it was just a slope to make.
Richard, it's like it's an age-old tale. You just follow the money, and that's where you can figure out. You follow the incentive. And what was really interesting about all these like so-called ESG funds and ESG proposals and DEI and everything else, it was just all about the money, and it was a money grab. Because when you were looking for to make extra money, you just slapped an ESG logo on a fund. You could charge 2 to 3 times the amount for it, and you really didn't do anything except you had your own criteria of what that fund would be. And it was really funny, especially once Russia invaded Ukraine, there were all of these ESG funds that had excluded defense companies from them. And then all of a sudden, when Russia invaded Ukraine, they put the defense companies back in, because all of a sudden these defense companies were defending democracy. And so there was a lot of hypocrisy, and even there was no real criteria about what was ESG, what wasn't. But then it was funny about how the definition would just shift depending on the year, depending on the topic.
It's crazy. So when did you start hearing rumblings about Anheuser-Busch and Bud Light and the problems there?
So, it was really interesting. One of the reasons that I left Anheuser-Busch is not only did I see this broader kind of corporate America being taken over by politics and the ESG and DEI narrative, when I was living in Atlanta and as president of Anheuser-Busch COVID time period, but I even saw it internally, Anheuser-Busch change the station. When I joined because they pitched that we're a meritocracy. We hire the best and the brightest. We give you opportunities to grow. But in that 2020-21 timeframe, even the organization, they dropped meritocracy really as one of their 10 principles, and they replaced it with, now we promote people based off the diversity of their teams. And it was like very clear what that meant. And I was like kind of questioning that as an organization, especially when there were certain parts of the organization, like the marketing team would highlight like, oh, we're 50%, male, female ratio, and we're diverse. I'm like, great. But like our logistics organization, which has a bunch of people that are working like in cold warehouses, lifting heavy beer, these are like jobs that is traditionally more male dominated jobs. There's very few women that want to work in cold, dark warehouses and lift kegs all day long. And all of a sudden, like, we're being asked like, hey, can you guys get, more women in the warehouse? And we're like, well, hey, if they want to, they can apply, but it's just not a job that's very desirable for women. Nobody asked why we don't have any male secretaries at the organization, but people are asking now, like, why don't we have like female warehouse workers? And it's like, well, it just doesn't make sense. So hey, I saw the company internally changing. And so this is the beginning of 2022. This is when I kind of left the organization. So it was a year before the Dylan Mulvaney kind of meltdown, because I just saw the company changing. One other thing that was problematic to me is the organization, especially Bud Light, used to pride itself on did you win the Super Bowl Ad Meter Award every single year? That was essentially like, if you're the best marketer in the United States, you would try and win that Super Bowl Ad Meter Award. That kind of hits sort of the pulse of the country. And that's frankly allow you to sell a ton of beer. And even the organization kind of switched to try and start winning these Cannes Lion Awards over in Europe, because there's this Cannes, which is in France. It's a marketing organization. It's a global organization. And being in Europe, they have like very stringent ESG, DEI standards to win. And so of our marketing was changing, and we hadn't won a Super Bowl Ad Meter Award in years, whereas Bud and Bud Light to this day have the most Super Bowl Ad Meter wins, but they hadn't won in almost 10 years. And so a lot of our marketing was changing, and not, I thought for the better. So that's when I left. And then so I was so Vivek and I, we launched Strive at the beginning of 2022. And had a good amount of success getting that organization off the ground, where we were just going to invest into businesses, have them focus just on shareholder value, not necessarily get involved in any political issues outside of their mission. And funny enough, like we wrote a lot of shareholder letters to companies in 2022 to get launched. We wrote letters to Disney when they got involved in parental rights issues in Florida, wrote letters to Salesforce, who was like donating shareholder money to defund the police initiatives. And the week before Anheuser-Busch did the partnership with Dylan Mulvaney, I had a letter that was ready to go to Anheuser-Busch mentioning how they were uniquely susceptible to falling to stakeholder capitalism and some problems that they had internally. And it was interesting that literally when this letter, we were having to go through compliance, that's when the Dylan Mulvaney piece hit. And I mean, I'll never forget when they figured that first out with Dylan Mulvaney, and there was immediate backlash to it. You remember, I mean, like Kid Rock, he had his AR, 15, it was lighting up cases of Bud Light. Every country music star was saying what happened to Bud Light. And all of a sudden, I mean, it became just a meme immediately of kind of like what went, how did Bud Light all of a sudden get captured and did a partnership with Mulvaney? So I'm sitting here, and for the first almost 2 weeks, I just kind of watched just to see what unfolded. And I wanted to see what Anheuser-Busch's response was going to be as well, because I was pretty sure that they were going to try and take this middle of the ground approach, try not to either, upset all the people who are their loyal drinkers, but also trying to figure out how to satisfy sort of like the left contingent that wanted them to do more partnerships with Dylan Mulvaney. Given where things were politically at the time, it was going to be impossible to do that. If you recall, sort of the whole movement towards sort of, I'll call it, what was just an acceptance of like, do I care what anybody over the age of 18, how they dress or, how they identify or whatever else? Like, no, I could care less. But there are a lot of political issues with like the transgender movement. Most contentious is like, should biological men be able to compete against biological women in sports? And especially in that 2023 time period, I think like on the ballot in 16 states was like movements to ban biological men from competing against, women in sports. So, and there was also the whole piece.
Yeah, you know why? Because when I've seen that happen, the women get hurt sometime for life. They would compete as hard as they could and just get trounced. Their whole career was ruined. And like I said, I've seen wrestling matches, other ones where they literally were hurt to the point where like they couldn't, they were damaged forever by this. So it was a terrible thing.
Terrible. So, I mean, it was very contentious. And Dylan Mulvaney was at the forefront of this as well, also on the gender affirmation care. And this is irreversible surgery where you're cutting out people's body parts. And Dylan Mulvaney was at the White House with Joe Biden talking about gender affirmation care and talking about how sort of it's a right. So Dylan was at the forefront, very political type of figure, not just somebody who was, casually, like an actor or actress, but someone who's highly involved in controversial transgender politics. And the other thing people forget about is the 3 days before the partnership with Dylan Mulvaney, which happened actually on April Fool's Day, April 1st, 2023, if you remember, there was that transgender student that shot up a Christian school in Tennessee. So the whole transgender issue, and it was front and center in national news all that week. And that was still sort of the transgender student wrote a manifesto. It still hasn't been released. So it's very much sort of, topical of an issue. And for something like Bud Light, which Bud Light became the largest beer brand in the United States because it was remarkably like apolitical. I mean, it appealed to absolutely everybody because it dealt with things that generally brought all Americans together. Bud Light was about football, and it was about sports, and it was about backyard barbecues and music festivals and fun. I mean, it was legitimately like one of the most fun brands, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, with like some unbelievable, memorable campaigns.
The frog.
There's a frogs, Real Men of Genius, the Was Up commercials, Spuds McKenzie when they launched in the 80s. And there was probably no more just fun brand that you were the life of the party if you brought Bud Light and you kind of knew about the Bud Light jokes. So then all of a sudden when this brand does this partnership with Dylan Mulvaney, where they put Dylan Mulvaney's face on a can, and Dylan Mulvaney has, tens of millions of followers on Instagram, all of a sudden all these loyal followers of Bud Light were like, wait a minute, what I thought Bud Light was like just, fun and football and this. And the first response of the corporation was, well, hey, like, we do cans for lots of different people and we're celebrating a milestone. And these Bud Light drinkers that were like, wait a minute, like Bud Light was just, again, funny and sports. Now all of a sudden, like we celebrate milestones of like biological men transitioning to females in this highly charged political environment that we're in. Like that's not Bud Light. That's like stuff like Ben and Jerry's does. Like Ben and Jerry's is a brand that's like, hey guys, like we use, ice cream to advance a social mission. They're very proud of that. It's right on their website.
I like how Ben and Jerry's talked about, companies should give up their offices because they're on ancestral tribal land. And then someone tweeted, what about your company, your headquarters? It's on tribal land. And of course they said nothing.
Right. And then there was silence, it's always like, do as I say, not as I do, type of situation. But like, I'll at least give it to Ben and Jerry's because like they're at least wide open about their corporate mission. And again, we use ice cream to advance a social progressive mission. They have their flavors like, Pecan Resist, which was the one they did when Trump first got elected. They do like empowerment for like, the women's issues. And at least like, when you're buying Ben and Jerry's, you know what you're supporting and you can choose to buy that or not. I think where Bud Light went wrong is, again, people bought Bud Light because it was just like, fun and a very like, apolitical brand. But then when it got into politics, then people were like, wait a minute, like, who's this thing for? And then they could never really explain what the brand was about.
Here's what I don't understand is like, I saw they started losing money like crazy and it was all over the news and they still kept on. Then they put out this commercial that made me and probably a lot of other people even more angry. It was like this Americana commercial where a truck is climbing a mountain. And they knew exactly who their customers were. And they put out that one commercial and all that told everyone is like, yeah, we're deliberately doing this. And we know who our real customers are. We're pissing in their face by doing this. It just made no sense. Like they doubled down, tripled down, quadrupled down, and the billions just kept getting lost. It would amaze me.
No, I mean, it was amazing. I mean, like, and you nailed you nailed it right on the head. Because like, actually like the path to redemption with our customers, it goes through forgiveness. But to be forgiven, you actually have to admit that you made a mistake in the first place. And that's something that Anheuser-Busch still has not done to this day. Like that advertisement you're talking about, they released it, I think, like on April 15th. And so it was 2 weeks after the partnership with Dylan Mulvaney. They did it on a Friday and they had this tweet out. They'd gone dark for 2 weeks and they released that commercial where it was just like Clydesdales running through America and like big trucks and whatever else. And, there was some nothing burger statement that just said, hey, we didn't mean to get involved in anything. But they never admitted like what the controversy was, why they were in it in the first place, what they did wrong. And then they put out some tweet on Twitter. It was just TGIF ? With the can of Bud Light. And usually, like when they put something on Twitter, there's maybe like 100 comments on it. They got 30,000 comments on that tweet that night. And 99.9% of them were negative because exactly what you said, like they never admitted of like, listen, like they could have admitted to their loyal customers, listen, we screwed up. Bud Light was never a political brand. We never should have done a partnership with Dylan Mulvaney. And we're going to get back to like, football and fun. And like, here's a commercial that we should have done 2 weeks ago. Sorry, moved on. And I think they could have ended it right there. But the problem is because this company had gotten so captured over time. They had moved their commercial headquarters from St. Louis to New York City a couple years previously. They had a big partnership with a lot of media agencies that were it's called GAR, with like generally accepted media standards. And they had the BlackRock, Stacey Mayer, where they had adopted their ESG and DEI policies. They had just released their 2022 ESG report, which was 120 pages long. Literally a week before this happened as well, they were captured. So they could not apologize to their loyal customers, nor could they say that Bud Light was now going to be like essentially the new Ben and Jerry's brand. And I mean, you get this, like when you walk through the middle of any sort of like cultural war, cultural battlefield, you get shot at from both sides. So they didn't choose a side and they got shot at and they still are. And not only did they lose 30% of their customers that when it happened, they've continued to lose that. And now they've cycled that down 30% and they're still down 5 or 6% again this year. So they continue to lose more and more customers. They haven't gotten any of them back.
What's the total damage to the brand? What's it estimated to be at this point?
So if you take a look at in the United States, the company did about $6 billion worth of profits in the United States. It was about $15 billion of revenue, $6 billion of profits. Once that happened, the company went to $4 billion of profits. They almost lost $2 billion of profits with Bud Light. Bud Light, it was 40% of the sales in the United States. So it was the largest brand for an Anheuser-Busch ad. It was the largest beer brand in the United States. And so it was down 30%, it's down another couple percent. And so the company lost $2 billion of earnings. The stock price before this all hit was approximately, around $70 a share. and it's currently at $50 a share. And this is despite stock markets being at all-time highs. They haven't recovered at all. There's a lot of other kind of global headwinds the company's facing as well. But this is, frankly, like, I don't think they're going to get it back with the current management team in place. They missed an opportunity to get their customers back. I think it's going to take sort of a whole different management team, a whole different philosophy, and a whole different structure to get this company going back to where it needs to be.
I mean, is the brand dead forever, or they're just keeping it? Like, why not rename it, or why not retire it, come out with something new, same formulation? Like, what are they doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually like my thought, my solution on this one. So I actually think the best thing that the company could do is actually sell their business in the United States. And as I mentioned earlier, so like Anheuser-Busch is part of this global company called Anheuser-Busch InBev. It's the world's largest beer company. They're the largest beer industry like in Europe and in China, in South America. And in aggregate, the company does about $50 billion worth of revenue. So the U.S. is one of their larger business units, does about $15 billion. But I think that what they would be better off doing from a shareholder standpoint is they sell the United States business, because the United States business is a little bit different than the rest of the organization. In the United States, they don't have the same portfolio of brands. They have more of, I'll call it like your core customers, your core drinkers. It's Budweiser, it's Bud Light, it's Natural Light, it's Busch Light. Outside of the United States, they have, I'll call it more like premium brands, Stella Artois, Corona, brands that are more sort of like premium. And then also in the United States, they have to go through what's known as the three-tier system, which is a group of distributors that are independent, kind of wholesalers, family-owned businesses to sell their brands. Whereas outside the United States, they tend to go direct to other areas. And I think here in the United States, they could actually sell the company back to U.S. investors. I think there's new U.S. investors. They could come back in and say, now, this is once again American-owned. We have new people that are in charge of the brand. Here's what Bud Light is. Bud Light is going to go back to being about what it's supposed to be, which is easy to drink, easy to enjoy. We're going to get back to doing like football. They've recently hired Shane Gillis, which was great, but it still hasn't moved the brand needle at all. And you go on a big PR tour that says, now again, we're back focusing on our customers. We know who we are. We got Americans back in charge of this thing. And I really think that could be great for both sides, because the global company, Anheuser-Busch InBev, they're still struggling with a lot of debt that they incurred by purchasing SAB Miller, so South Africa Brewery Millers, about 6 or 7 years ago. And if they sell the U.S. business, they could pay down this debt. They could focus on sort of their overseas emerging markets. You sell the brand back to U.S. investors. And I think that if you come back out and you do a good PR tour, I really think that you could get back 50% of your Bud Light drinkers overnight. And I think long-term, you can get back a lot more of them as well. And then you can go and you can create like a much better business unit here in the U.S. back in the hands of sort of like Americans who understand the consumer and take it out of sort of this larger global organization.
I don't know. I mean, just being a regular person, what I saw is not that people were mad at Bud Light. They were actively happy that no one was buying it. Like, I saw many videos and montages where people were laughing, and like it became fun to rag on them. Like, people wanted them to go out of business. I know it's a terrible thing to say, but that's the sentiment I see. It's not just like they're upset at them. They want them to go under. It may only be years more before that goes away. That's the point it got to, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It became like the fun, popular thing to do. I mean, there were so many videos that I saw of you'd have like one line at a baseball park that was the Coors Light stand, and it was 20 people deep, and then you'd have the Bud Light stand and nobody was there. Or you'd have the grocery store and there would be like no beer where the Coors Light section was, or Bud Light was still filled up. But I think like the other thing is like, I actually think like Americans, they also, like, as much as they love to like pile on to people when they're having a tough time, they also have like great American comeback stories. And I think this could be like one of like the best comeback stories of all time. I mean, I don't know, like I like to talk about, like when Tiger Woods had his downfall, there was a lot of people that were wagging on Tiger Woods, and, he had a tough time with the whole Elin Norgan divorce and a very public breakup. The guy came on TV. I mean, you got to give him credit. He had like a 15-minute speech, apologized, went to rehab, all the things. And like, I was at the Masters in 2018 when that guy won it, and I've never seen a crowd come back around and like, get fired up for somebody like they did there. Like, I think that if you have the right people in charge and the right mentality, Americans love a good comeback story. If they have sort of a group of, like Shane Gillis, and then you get a bunch of other like, funny people, and you get some, large-scale influencers, like I really think that you could build this brand back again, and you could have like an amazing corporate turnaround story. But it's going to take not the current team they have in place to do that.
Well, what was happening with management and the board and everything at this time when they were losing money? Were they just, were you privy to any conversations? Like, what could have been said? When were they looking to blame somebody? Like, what were they doing?
No, I mean, that's sort of like the funny thing about all of this, because they only have themselves to blame. But I think, unfortunately, because a lot of the board tends to actually be based in Europe. And this goes back to sort of like philosophically, what should the purpose of a corporation be? Should it be sort of this like, Milton Friedman, American free market capitalism view that says companies should focus on shareholders? Or should you have this European view where like European companies, this is the European stakeholder model, should work closely with governments to try and social engineer certain policies? And I think because the board is captured by a lot of Europeans, and that's the mindset that they have, I think they almost gave the directive in the U.S. like, well, we don't want to upset sort of our European counterparts, and we have these ESG commitments that we've made, and we work with a lot of these media folks in New York City. I just think the board was captured. I think their CEO, this guy, Michel Ducaris, who Greek by background and also Brazilian, but he wears a lot of the UN pins and UN flags and talk about a lot of the work they do with the UN, has more like a globalist mindset, worked in China for a while, thinks they're sort of like one view for the whole world in terms of how companies should orchestrate. And then there was this pressure in the U.S. on their CEO, on the U.S. CEO named Brendan Whitworth, where he just couldn't do anything. He could not make a statement either way. He was forced basically just to adopt this European view that we're going to walk through the middle of this corporate minefield. And you even saw it. There was a disastrous interview that he did with CBS going into July 4th weekend, which is the number one beer selling weekend of the year. This is in 2023, where he went on CBS and he was trying to sort of repair the image of the company where they'd been losing those, the sales for 3 months now. And he was asked twice by the CBS host. The first time they said, hey, you as a CEO, would you do this partnership with Dylan Mulvaney again? And he gave this real mealy-mouthed, wishy-washy answer of like, well, there's a lot of things going on. There's a corporation. You can and can't do things. And he had this really wandering answer. So the person came back again and said, you do realize that the reason that you're in the predicament you're in is because of the exact answer you gave. You've given multiple mealy-mouthed non-answers. Let me ask again, like, would you do this again? And again, he didn't answer the question. Went on for another 2 or 3 minutes in a very wandering way, and then into the interview, and that again prolonged the problem. But it was essentially because he was essentially captured by sort of the CEO that just has a different philosophical outset than I would say most people here in the U.S. about what a corporation should be doing, what a corporation should be focused on. And that's why, again, I think they should probably sell the U.S. business unit, just because I think there's just a philosophical difference between sort of the European mindset and the American mindset about how business and about how capitalism should work.
But now, if they're all about money, then in the face of obvious losses like that, how could they say, nope, we're going to keep going?
Part of it is like for these guys, like, I don't know if they are about money at this point. A lot of these are families that have generational wealth and they're all billionaires. And for them, if they all of a sudden take a stand, which seems to be, I'll call it like the, I don't necessarily believe that it would be, but a anti-trans or a bigoted stance because they don't come out and affirmably say, hey, Bud Light's now going to do tons of partnerships with Dylan Mulvaney. That's just sort of a brand call. But I think that for a lot of these controlling shareholders, where there's these Belgian and Brazilian families that they're worth billions of dollars, for them, it's almost not about money, but it's still being invited to like the right cocktail parties and being able to show up at Davos every year to the World Economic Forum and be able to go on to, MSNBC and talk about whatever. Like, I think that's more important to a lot of these people. And unfortunately, like some of the dollars are. So the people that actually get left holding the bag are sort of everyday people that invest in the Anheuser-Busch. It's like, your firefighters and your police officers and your teachers whose pensions are invested in the Anheuser-Busch. They're the ones that actually get left holding the bag. And even last year, like I had some back in channels into some of the folks on the board. I was actually mentioned to a couple large investment firms here in the U.S. that they actually should buy that U.S. business unit. And they were kind of given a stiff arm and just said, not interested in selling. But so therefore, I don't think it's actually for these folks like really about the dollars. Otherwise, they would have made tons of changes. And the stock price hasn't moved in 15 years. And you still have sort of the same board, the same management team, the same CEO in place. So not holding people accountable. And it's unfortunately not about the money for these people, which is problematic for everyday shareholders.
So last thing, what do you think is going to happen in the next 5 years if it doesn't sell and it just continues? Is it just going to be like a zombie brand? It'll still do decently well, but or you think it'll get worse? Like, what's your thought?
Yeah, unfortunately, I still think that things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. The way that the beer industry works, companies spend hundreds of millions of dollars to literally like maintain their market share and their positioning. And it's really, really, really difficult to get that share back once you've lost it. Another reason is that the shelf space about where you buy beer, like beer is still something that's 90+% is bought in store. And if you don't have your beer on the shelf and you don't have it available, then no one's going to buy it. And usually your retailers, your Walmarts, your Krogers, your 7-Elevens, take space you get on the shelf based off your sales. And once you lose those sales and your sales continue to climb, they're going to continue to take space away. And you almost get sort of in this sort of like death spiral or doom spiral that continues to go downhill. So that's what you're seeing right now. And the company continues to pull resources away from Bud Light. They're investing into overseas markets that are growing faster. They're investing into other brands like Michelob Ultra. And they're like even turning out sort of like Bud Light handles and Bud Light shelf space, like Michelob Ultra space. So unfortunately, it's getting worse, but that's not actually improving the company overall. The company's beer volumes continue to be down. Their revenue continues to be flat. So I really think that the company needs a full shakeup from the board on down if they're going to be able to turn this thing around over the next 4 or 5 years.
Crazy. No. So where can people get Last Call for Bud Light? Is it in Amazon? Is it available now?
It comes out on February 4th this year, so you can pre-order it on Amazon, and then on February 4th, it'll be in bookstores nationwide as well. So we're looking forward to the launch and really appreciate you having me on board here.
Well, very good. Yeah, no, it's been a great call, and thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Richard.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.
Go on to, I don't know, MSNBC and talk about whatever. Like, I think that's more important to a lot of these people. And unfortunately, like some of the dollars are. So the people that actually get left holding the bag are sort of everyday people that invest in the Anheuser-Busch. It's like, your firefighters and your police officers and your teachers whose pensions are invested in the Anheuser-Busch. They're the ones that actually get left holding the bag. And even last year, like I had some back in channels into some of the folks on the board. I was actually mentioned to a couple large investment firms here in the U.S. that they actually should buy that U.S. business unit. And they were kind of given a stiff arm and just said, not interested in selling. But so therefore, I don't think it's actually for these folks like really about the dollars. Otherwise, they would have made tons of changes. And the stock price hasn't moved in 15 years. And you still have sort of the same board, the same management team, the same CEO in place. So not holding people accountable. And it's unfortunately not about the money for these people, which is problematic for everyday shareholders.
So last thing, what do you think is going to happen in the next 5 years if it doesn't sell and it just continues? Is it just going to be like a zombie brand? It'll still do decently well, but or you think it'll get worse? Like, what's your thought?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, like I still think that things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. The way that the beer industry works, I mean, companies spend hundreds of millions of dollars to literally like maintain their market share and their positioning. And it's really, really, really difficult to get that share back once you've lost it. Another reason is that the shelf space about where you buy beer, like beer is still something that's 90+% is bought in store. And if you don't have your beer on the shelf and you don't have it available, then no one's going to buy it. And usually your retailers, your Walmarts, your Krogers, your 7-Elevens, take space you get on the shelf based off your sales. And once you lose those sales and your sales continue to decline, they're going to continue to take space away. And you almost get sort of in this sort of like death spiral or doom spiral that continues to go downhill. So that's what you're seeing right now. And the company continues to pull resources away from Bud Light. They're investing into overseas markets that are growing faster. They're investing into other brands like Michelob Ultra. And they're like even turning out sort of like Bud Light handles and Bud Light shelf space, like Michelob Ultra space. So unfortunately, it's getting worse, but that's not actually improving the company overall. The company's beer volumes continue to be down. Their revenue continues to be flat. So I really think that the company needs a full shakeup from the board on down if they're going to be able to turn this thing around over the next 4 or 5 years.
Crazy. No. So where can people get Last Call for Bud Light? Is it in Amazon? Is it available now?
It comes out on February 4th this year, so you can pre-order it on Amazon, and then on February 4th, it'll be in bookstores nationwide as well. So we're looking forward to the launch and really appreciate you having me on board here.
Well, very good. Yeah, no, it's been a great call, and thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Richard.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed. Be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed. Is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.